Well, it's a great pleasure today. We've had some great discussions, very stimulating conversation this morning. We're looking forward to, to really digging in deeper. We've had the grand strategic overview, and we appreciate what Mike Vickers has had to say. Our two panelists now are Jamestown board member Bruce Hoffman. There's a lot of things you could say about Bruce. He has been studying terrorism for over 4 decades, and his knowledge of terrorism trends, developments, is just immense. He's a tenured professor at Georgetown University. He's the director of both the Center for Security Studies and the Security Studies program. He's a professor of terrorism studies part-time for St. Andrews University. He has been at RAND Corporation. He has been involved in everything related to U.S. counterterrorism analysis and strategy for more, as he said, for 4 decades, and he's written very prolifically about it. And Bruce will always give you the best insight on Al-Qaeda, terrorism groups, and now ISIS, and this merging. He has a merging of these groups and where they're going after the fall of ISIS in Raqqa and also in Iraq. Also joining us today is Fernando Reinares, who is director of the program on global terrorism at Elcano Royal Institute and professor of security studies at the Universidad Rey Juan Carlos in Madrid. He's also a Wilson Center Global Fellow, as well as an adjunct professor at Georgetown University. He has had extensive work in working on violent radicalization in Europe. His presentation today is going to be first-rate and be assessing and discussing developments in Spain and the most recent time. He's also the author of several books. Most recent of the titles include Al-Qaeda's Revenge, the 2004 Madrid train bombings, and more recently with which was published by Woodrow Wilson Press in 2017. So without further ado, I'll present the floor. Bruce, do you want to be seated or standing? How do you want to? Whatever is up to you. So, okay.
Great. Well, thank you, Glenn, for the very kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be back at the Jamestown Foundation Conference. I think I've only missed one in the past 11 years, which was due to unforeseen developments. So I'm also very pleased to be here with my old friend, Fernando Reinares. If I've been studying terrorism for over 40 years, we've been friends for over 30 years and first met at a terrorism conference in 1986. So we've both attained, I think, the status now of being genuine graybeards with the expertise that goes with that. So what I'd like to do is talk about the threat much more generally and then hand it over to Fernando, who will talk about a case study and also focus on the country that not only is at the front line in the struggle against terrorism, but the most recent victim of a successful terrorist attack in Europe as well. So, and Glenn has also asked us to keep our remarks to 15 minutes each. So the bumper sticker, or the bottom line of my very brief remarks, is that ISIS is here to stay, and Al-Qaeda hasn't gone away. So that's fundamentally very depressing outlook. Let me explain why, and there are basically 5 reasons why ISIS is here to stay, at least for the foreseeable future. First and foremost is, like all successful terrorist organizations, and one has to say, even though, as General McMaster said, ISIS has lost 95% of its territory, has suffered grievous battlefield setbacks, at the same time, in anticipation of this development, they put into place a strategy to ensure ISIS's longevity and survival beyond even these massive setbacks. Firstly, even 2 or 3 years before the landmark November 2015 Paris attacks, ISIS had put in place an external operations network across Europe. Now, this is enormously important for several reasons. Firstly, at the time, the prevailing wisdom, or the conventional wisdom, is that firstly, ISIS's violence would remain confined to the already volatile, unstable Middle East, and secondly, that ISIS didn't even have the interest, much less the capability, in striking outside of the Levant in Iraq. Well, that, of course, was proven demonstrably false with the Paris attacks. This external operations network also extends beyond Europe. Already in September 2016, as the handwriting was clearly on the wall, the founder and leader of ISIS, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, had called on would-be foreign fighters, wannabes, and told them not to come to the caliphate, not to come to the immolating Islamic State, but instead to migrate to the branches. And this is the second reason to ensure ISIS's survival, is that it borrowed a page from al-Qaeda's playbook, the same way that al-Qaeda, over a decade ago, understood that it had to cede some of its central command and control authority to what were then known as the franchises or al-Qaeda's affiliates in order to ensure its longevity. ISIS has done exactly the same thing. And I think the consequences of this should have been understood long before the past few months. For example, in October 2015, the first successful terrorist attack against a commercial aviation target in over a decade was perpetrated not by ISIS Central, but by one of the ISIS branches, and that was its branch in the Sinai when they brought down a Russian charter flight departing from Sharm el-Sheikh and killed all 244 persons abroad. I think that the traction of this strategy was demonstrated very clearly last May when an ISIS attack was perpetrated against a concert venue in Manchester where the pop star Ariana Grande was appearing. I have to say that in 40-plus years of studying terrorism, I always think that I've seen absolutely the most heinous and grievous assaults on innocent victims, but the fact that this attack deliberately singled out young women and their parents gathering, that this was part of the planning, shows that terrorism has certainly crossed yet another red line under ISIS. And then, of course, we have the attack. Oh, and I should back up and say that that attack was perpetrated by an ISIS cell operating out of Benghazi, Libya. And then, of course, just this past summer, we had the attack in Las Ramblas in Barcelona by an ISIS cell who I understand has connections in Morocco and elsewhere, further afield too. So we see that ISIS's branches are still able to carry out enormously consequential terrorist attack with, of course, the most recent one over the Thanksgiving weekend against a Sufi mosque in the northern Sinai that killed over 300 persons. The third reason that I think ISIS will continue to challenge us is the proliferation of foreign fighters that the group was able to achieve over the past 3 or 4 years that really changed the nature of terrorism. Upwards of 40,000 foreign fighters from some 120 countries throughout the world, two-thirds of the world's countries, gravitated to the former Islamic State. In this sense, they were able to completely destroy any efforts to profile the stereotypical or the canonical Salafi jihadi fighter. If one thinks back to the 9/11 attacks on 2001, there were 19 hijackers, 15 were from Saudi Arabia, there was one from the United Arab Republics, another from Lebanon, another from Egypt, basically all young Arab males from the Middle East or from the Arabian Peninsula. Yet when you're able to draw on a reservoir of over 120 countries, you have the ability to recruit jihadis from such atypical sources of terrorists as, at least in the past, as Benin, Bangladesh, Canada, and even the island state of Trinidad and Tobago, which has produced a disproportionate number of foreign fighters given its population. And one has to say that although many of them, as analysts and policymakers have proclaimed, have in fact been killed on the battlefield, there's still at least thousands that survive and that have been able to escape Syria. I would argue that even today, some of them are most likely parked in the Balkans, laying low for the time being, but awaiting the opportunity to infiltrate themselves into the rest of Europe. Fourth, the reason that ISIS will remain is its innovative, revolutionary use of social media, of which much has been said, but ISIS really has, in this sense, by using various commercially available, readily accessible, in many instances free apps, has been able to engage in what another colleague of ours, Professor Gabriel Weiman, has called narrowcasting. Instead of the broadcasting of the internet or of traditional media that basically throws out a message to whoever might be listening or watching or logged on, narrowcasting enabled ISIS to very specifically and very deliberately identify constituencies or groups of people, whether in schools, athletic teams, community associations, mosques, and so on, whom they could target through their friends or through their social network and thus draw into the maw of jihad. And then finally, in recent months, ISIS has pioneered a novel third form of attack. Since 9/11 and even before, we've lived with the threat of terrorist attacks being perpetrated by groups following very specific direct orders as part of a defined command and control process. Of course, in more recent years, we've seen the opposite end of the spectrum, where individuals acting completely on their own with no previous connections, ties to a terrorist organization are motivated, inspired, and ultimately animated to carry out terrorist attacks. In fact, the attack against the Port Authority bus terminal in New York City on Monday is an exemplar of that, as was the Halloween Day attack. But yet, ISIS has gone even further and has found the sweet spot in between the spectrum of those two attacks and has now been promoting what has been referred to as the enabled attacker. In other words, someone that is, once again, like the lone wolf, operating completely on their own, has no prior ties to a terrorist organization, thus presents enormous challenges to the authorities to identify and interdict. But in a nod to, let's say, the command and control type attacker, is now being furnished, perhaps not with training, but with very specific targeting instructions and intelligence in order to better facilitate and ensure the success of the lone wolf attack. And I think a chilling example of this that was revealed last March in the United States was ISIS's very generous provision of a targeting list of some 8,000 Americans that included their home and business addresses, their emails addresses for harassment and threats, and even their cell phone numbers. So in sum, ISIS in a very short period of time has changed the nature of terrorism. And you don't change the nature of terrorism and then very quietly disappear. Well, if ISIS is here to say, then as I said earlier, Al-Qaeda hasn't gone away, at least in my estimation. Al-Qaeda is sitting back, biding its time, gleefully observing as we become completely preoccupied and transfixed with ISIS while Al-Qaeda rebuilds in Afghanistan in particular. It expands to Bangladesh, to Kashmir, and elsewhere, and especially puts down even deeper roots in Syria. Today, the largest quote-unquote rebel force in Syria is Al-Qaeda's Syrian arm, and then fulfilling bin Laden's edict from 2010, which we know bin Laden was very concerned about the Al-Qaeda brand, that it was losing its allure. It was also attracting undue attention. He had then posited the idea that Al-Qaeda franchises should change their names. And of course, its Syrian arm has undergone at least 4 or 5 different changes. It's now known as Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS. It has at least 20,000 men under arms, controls the entirety of the strategic Idlib province alongside Turkey. And indeed, Al-Qaeda has dispatched some of its most senior and valued commanders to oversee its operations in Syria. Fortunately, 2 of them, Muhsin al-Fadli and Haider Kirkan, have both been killed in U.S. airstrikes or drone attacks. But probably the person at the apex of Al-Qaeda's operational experience, Saif al-Adil, a former member of the Egyptian army, a special forces officer. He's the Zelig of Al-Qaeda. He has been at sort of the pivotal spots throughout Al-Qaeda's history, going back to the 1980s, whether it was training the first batch of Mujahideen that joined Al-Qaeda after 1988, helping to plot and plan the 1998 attacks on the U.S. embassies in East Africa, a key role in overseeing the Al-Qaeda's campaign in Saudi Arabia in 2003. He is now in Syria directing its operations there. All right, very briefly, before I hand over to Fernando, since I'm just about at the 15 minutes, what do we do? Well, here I'm very heartened because my prescriptions were actually presaged by General McMaster when he spoke. He identified terrorist access to sanctuary and safe haven as being perhaps the preeminent problem that we face in terms of countering the terrorist threat today, and also what has to be amongst our highest priorities. I think this is underscored, going back to my first point about ISIS's longevity. In September 2014, at the start of coalition operations against ISIS, according to the National Counterterrorism Center, just across the river in Northern Virginia, ISIS had a presence in 7 countries throughout the world. Despite these Herculean efforts to take down ISIS, by the following year, its presence in countries had doubled to 15. And in August 2016, it had a presence in some 18 countries throughout the world. So clearly, Baghdadi's strategy of cultivating branches has an antecedent, as ISIS anticipated, the demise of the Islamic State, but also has been successful. Similarly, at least according to my own count, al-Qaeda has a presence in more than 24 countries throughout the world. That's about roughly 3 to 4 times the number it had in 2008. Secondly, exactly as General McMaster said, countering what has continued to be a problem that once we thought was relegated to the Cold War but has emerged as a salient problem that continues into the 21st century is either active or passive sponsorship by states of terrorism. I would commend to you not only Fernando's excellent book, Al-Qaeda's Revenge, but also the book titled The Exile by Kathy Scott Clark and Adrian Levy, which depicts precisely how both bin Laden and Al-Qaeda were able to survive in the decade following the 9/11 attacks and the declaration of the war on terrorism. And Pakistan and Iran played a singularly large role in its survival. There are other states today that continue to support terrorism at one level or another, and I think very alarmingly from any terrorism analysis is that there are many states that increasingly in the Middle East and elsewhere regard al-Qaeda as quote-unquote moderate extremists as a more palatable or acceptable alternative to ISIS, and are willing to make a pact with the devil as a cat's paw against ISIS. And then finally, and this touches on an excellent point that Mike Vickers made as well, and this is that it's imperative that we analyze the threat soberly, objectively, and unemotionally. I think we have to avoid the trap of wishful thinking, and I think the ambassador's question about how we got the Arab Spring so wrong is a case in point. But also, I think we have to abjure from the temptation to declare victory in the war on terrorism precipitously. Exactly as Mike said, this is a long struggle. Countering this already is going to take yet another generation beyond today, and I think it's only when we become complacent, not only are we most vulnerable, but we fail to finish off the struggle that we began 16 years ago. So let me stop there.
Thank you, Bruce. Fernando? Fernando, you've come all the way from Spain. Thank you. And also you braved several cancellations of air flights and a lot of snow to get here. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed. It's a real pleasure to be here today. So thanks a lot to you as president of the Jamestown Foundation. Very, very popular among my students, by the way. This is why when I told them I was going to miss a class because of my presence today here, they may not complain. I was already delighted to meet some of your people. Jacob Sen, which is also a reference for my students as well as for me. Also a privilege to share this table with my dearest friend and admire colleague, Bruce Hoffman. Every time he mentions the fact that we met for the first time in 1986 in this terrorism conference in Aberdeen in Scotland, I had kind of a regression. I become suddenly a humble student of terrorism, and probably this is what I am after all these years, contrary to him. His approach was a more global one, and I will try to focus on a case, the case of Spain, where individuals related to Islamic State have perpetrated the last attack in Western Europe, to see the extent to which the global trends can reflect what is going on at the national level. Allow me to start by reminding you something very obvious, that we are living since 2012 this unprecedented wave of jihadist mobilization affecting the Western Europe, but Western Europe in particular. The estimates on individuals who have advanced or completed the process of radicalization is astonishing. We have to refer to 20-something thousands in the case of the UK, no less than 20,000 in the case of France, 2,000 in the case of such a small country as Belgium. So this is very very worrying in itself. So it already tells you about something which is not going to disappear overnight. Think about the production of foreign fighters. 1/5 of all foreign terrorist fighters who have traveled to Syria and Iraq over the past 5 years departed from Europe, from Western Europe, leaving aside Russia or the Balkans, from Western Europe. Which means that Western European foreign fighters are nearly 20 times overrepresented with respect to, or to say that in other words, young Muslims living in Western Europe are nearly 20 times overrepresented with respect to young Muslims from every other region in the world when it comes to providing to this foreign fighter contingent in Syria and Iraq. 8 countries within Western Europe have been particularly, or the European Union have been particularly affected by this phenomenon. And you will not find among those 8 countries, you will not find neither all those countries having the largest population, the largest Muslim populations in Europe. You don't have, for instance, Italy or Spain among the 8 countries who were more affected by this jihadist mobilization. Those countries where, with respect to the total population or with respect to Muslim populations, levels of radicalization or production of foreign fighters have been particularly high. You will not even have among those 8 countries the European Union member state with the largest percentage of population, of Muslim population as part of the total population, which is Bulgaria. And sometimes we forget about that. Because the problem is not with countries, it's not that much with countries where population is centuries old and well embedded with the national population and such. No, with, or at least not that so intensely with countries where the population, the Muslim population, is made out predominantly of first-generation migrants. The problem in Western Europe is largely focused on countries where the Muslim populations are predominantly made out of second and even third or fourth generations. And that's where you have France, Belgium, the UK, Germany, Sweden, Denmark, the Netherlands, or Austria. But that's where you don't have Spain, Italy, Portugal, Greece, or Bulgaria. So it is not by accident that between June 2014, when Islamic State adopted that denomination and the caliphate was proclaimed, and July 2017, all attacks in Western Europe, all attacks, either by individuals or by cells, or all attacks have took place in 6 out of these 8 countries. The pattern just changed last August with the attacks in Catalonia's region of Spain. Still, what we are going to see in Catalonia, what we saw in Catalonia, is part of the general pattern in Western Europe. Even though in Spain, the vast majority of the population, of Muslim population, is first generation, it's made of first generation migrants, those who perpetrated the attacks in Barcelona and Cambrils, and those attacks are far from what they really had in mind. Those attacks were improvised attacks, rudimentary ones, compared with what they really had in mind, were perpetrated by a cell of 10 individuals, 9 of them second generation. 9 of them second generation of Moroccan origins. So, you see, before the attacks in Barcelona and Cambrils, we at Elcano, we had a very clear idea, and time and again, we're sharing this idea with the media and in conference and so on, not always gaining the sympathy of local authorities in Catalonia, I have to say. But our idea was very clear from the empirical analysis that we are making of every single individual arrested in the country since 2012. Every single individual. We have a database, perhaps unique database, on all individuals arrested and sent to jail for jihadist terrorism offenses. We were clear on the fact that if something was about to happen, if something was to happen in Spain, it was going to be an attack perpetrated by young men of Moroccan origin. If something was to happen in Spain, it was to be an attack taking place in the region of Catalonia, and more precisely in the province of Barcelona, because of the concentration and the centrality of this area in Spain's jihadism. And if something was to take place in Spain, it wasn't going to be a lone wolf attack. It was meant to be an attack perpetrated by a cell. We came to this conclusion by making an analysis of individuals, as I say, arrested for jihadist terrorism offenses in the country. Since the first Syria-related operation was launched by the security forces on 2013. And as you can see, we are speaking basically about men, aged between 18 and 35, half of them married, not uncommon. I mean, the institution of marriage has a different meaning for them. Therefore, perhaps many of you, Moroccan nationals or Spanish nationals with Moroccan origins, descendants of Moroccan immigrants. As I say, despite the fact that the Spain's Muslim population is predominantly first generation, second generations predominate among jihadists in Spain. Unemployment rate, 23% among them. You know, this is 1 point below, not above, but 1 point below the unemployment rate for Spaniards in general, 18 years and older. 1/3 of them, nearly 1/3 of them, with criminal trajectory. And we were able to, although we have some missing cases, but we were able to establish, following very, very close analysis of the judicial and police files, that most of them had elemental knowledge of Islam and Sharia. Now, nearly 4 out of every 10 we are living in Catalonia. And if we count not those individuals who were residents of Ceuta and Melilla, you know, the 2 Spanish enclaves in North Africa surrounded by Moroccan territory, I think Catalonia is like an epicenter in this Western Mediterranean area of Salafism in general, The Salafi concentration is astonishing in that region, and we have this connection between Salafism and Jihadism, very clearly so. Jihadists in Spain tend to come from no longer from large areas and metropolitan areas, but from small towns and middle-sized cities across the territory. Now, see what the Associated Press, this is the Agence France Presse, wrote following the attacks in Cambrils. You know, the people in Cambrils, I mean, they were shocked. This is a small town of 10,000 people. They were shocked about this. Individuals, they describe as the kids, and the population in general, Muslims and non-Muslims. Muslims are about 5% of the population there. But everybody agrees that in the schools, the teachers, the social workers, in the sports club where they used to play football and so on, that those kids were completely integrated. They were able to speak in Arabic, in French, in Catalan, in Spanish. We have, among them, we have the elder brothers and the younger brothers. The elder brothers, 5 of them, but with 3 having college education level. The older, those who were 18 years and older, they were driving Audis and big Kawasaki's. So what I mean is that the issue sometimes is not just simply about social integration in socioeconomic terms, the way perhaps has become all too topical in the media and elsewhere. Allow me to emphasize the fact that most of those individuals were radicalized in the company of other people, not online. Are we overemphasizing of online? Is this phenomenon evolving towards something different? The 2 factors that we found in the case of Spain, absolutely critical. I mean, 7 out of every 10 people coincide in having these 2 factors, not other socioeconomic variables, but 7 out of every 10 people were first exposed to the action of a radicalizing agent, more often in person than not. And secondly, those individuals who became radicalized were individuals who had previous social bonds with other individuals already radicalized, typically in the same local area. Because what we have found in our study, and it is already known in the case of France, and our colleague Lorenzo Bedino made it clear in his last publication, is that this phenomenon of radicalization is not happening uniformly. There where you have 20% of Muslim population, you have about 20% of radicals. This is not the case. The phenomenon is taking place in pockets, in clusters, and it has a strong local dimension. Look about the repulse cell. How the 2 factors are very, very clear in this particular case. You have this individual, Es-Sati, the imam of one of the smaller mosques in Ripoll. He doesn't even have beer because he took every measure to prevent others from thinking that he was a radical. He was very good in teaching his followers how to behave, so as to, I mean, you would call it this taquilla probably, but how to behave, avoiding, phones and on internet communications, emails, all these kind of things, and evolve on a secure environment. Now, what is important is that Sati was already part of radical jihadist circles a decade ago. He was one of those individuals who now, in the context of this new jihadist mobilization, reactivates. And then the other factor, the factor I just mentioned, how important those pre-existing social bonds based on neighborhood, based on friendship, based on kinship are. Leaving aside Sati, who is a Moroccan, 35, so he was already in radical jihadist circles related to the Madrid bombing attacks, by the way, 10 years ago, in his early 30s. Leaving aside Sati, among the 9 young men, we have 4 couples of brothers and 4 cousins. Isn't that astonishing? I mean, and they were all neighbors, and they were all friends, and they came to the same schools and were part of the same. I mean, taking part in the same activities, in the same institutions, and sports and recreational centers, and so on. Now, I just say something about the social characteristics of these individuals, what we are finding in the case of Spain, which might be relevant to other cases with respect to radicalization, and just a few words about involvement. Maybe relevant to this Islamic State Al-Qaeda issue. As Professor Hoffman just stated, Islamic State is going to remain. But Al-Qaeda might be benefiting from its decline, even in the context of Western societies. What we found, and this is interesting, what we found, analyzing conversations and documents and testimonies from every single individual, a total of 230 individuals arrested in Spain over the past 5 years. What we found is that, yes, for them, for 95% of them, Islamic State was an organization of reference. But this was perfectly compatible with having Al-Qaeda as also an organization of reference. Al-Qaeda, and by that I mean Al-Qaeda Central, or Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, or Jabhat al-Nusra, and so on. Most jihadists in Spain were part of cells, groups, and networks, 88% of them. So very little room for lone actors. Are we overestimating the role and importance of lone actors? An interesting thing, 1/4 of all those individuals who are part of cells, groups, and networks already with operational capabilities, meaning they were thinking about planning, preparing, and executing attacks. Only one cell was able to finally execute attacks, and not the way they thought. But we found in the course of our research, and this is coming soon in English, we found that Abaoud's network wanted to attack Barcelona before attacking Paris. Barcelona was the target of the Abaoud network, and the attack was going to take place on September 2015. Fortunately, a joint operation in which contributions from the Spain's Guardia Civil and the Mossos d'Esquadra, the Catalonian Autonomous Police, well understood by Dolores Delgado, whom you know, the leading counterterrorism prosecutor in Spain's National Court, made it possible to dismantle this with arrests in Spain and in Eastern Europe. Now, just my last You see, this is the map of jihadism in Spain. As you can see, leaving aside Ceuta and Melilla, Girona and Barcelona are the main area of jihadist radicalization and activism. So it was not by accident that the attacks took place there. Sometimes mathematics help to understand the evolution of facts. What I would like to mention with respect to this map is that contrary to what happened before in the years, say, between 2002 and 2010, where jihadist cells in Spain had a lot of contacts between them. I mean, the Abu Dada cell was linked to the GIA cell and the TTP cell, which tried to operate in Barcelona again, 2008, had contacts with other jihadists in Madrid. What we have now is very few operational contacts between cells inside Spain. That's the change. That they're more opaque, they're more closed. So they're adapting to the circumstances, and this means becoming hardest for police forces to detect the phenomenon. But this is the change. The continuity is that nowadays, as well as in the past, the majority of those cells have organizational connections with jihadist organizations based abroad. Not integrated into, but having contact with. Well, the last of my slides today is just a promotional one. But not only. Allow me to say how important this is that four individuals already linked to the Abu Dada cell, to the Al-Qaeda cell in Spain, established by Abu Musa al-Zuri in 1995. Four individuals who were able to escape detention when the cell was dismantled late in 2001, following the information about the strong connections between this cell and the 9/11 cell. Four individuals who, for one or the other reason, ended up not in prison, either because they were outside Spain or because the legislation in Spain was not criminalizing those kind of acts in those days. We changed our legislation in 2010 and then again in 2015 to accommodate it to the morphology of current jihadist terrorism. But four of those individuals have reactivated, following years of abeyance, of apparent disengagement and even de-radicalization, four individuals belonging to those who were already active in the 90s and in the early years in the following decade, had reactivated over the past 5 years as leaders of new cells, groups, and networks, including two individuals who were Guantanamo inmates. Handed over to Spain. In Spain, they were released because judges with the legislation existing had trouble to, that was a technicality, to accept as proof the documents, the intelligence coming from American sources, and because of the way that was gathered in Afghanistan, in particular, when the two individuals were arrested in Afghanistan, they were set free in Spain. So they stay for years, apparently as disengaged and de-radicalized individuals. They are now both in prison because they both, as from 2012, started, reactivated and started the formation of cells with the intention of preparing people to, in those days, not to attack in Spain, but to be sent as foreign fighters to Syria and Iraq. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Fernando, and that's an excellent overview of the situation, especially some of that particular cell. I was very interested in what you would have to say about that cell in Rapol. We'll now open the floor to some questions and answers, and take a few. So let's start with here, this young lady in the middle. We're going to try to get to some people who haven't asked a question yet. Right? Wait for the mic, please. Thank you. And then we'll work our way back.
My name is Valerie Greenfeld. I am a consultant on terrorism issues, and I do a lot of writing. And I wanted to ask a question to Professor Hoffman about college campuses. I've been speaking with many parents that are concerned about their children not understanding radicalization and recruiting, and how they should protect them, they should educate them before they go off to college in the United States with regard to meeting people that may try to radicalize them or try to introduce them to some radical or extremist ideologies.
Less the focus of my work. Our colleague Lorenzo Vedino at the Project on Extremism in George Washington University would be much better to answer that. But I think you're right. It is a parental responsibility first and foremost, and to make sure that one's children understand that there are no simplistic solutions to complex problems, as both General McMaster and Mike Vickers spoke of earlier. Secondly, I think, is to instill in their children the values that deny prejudice, hatred, intolerance. These are all key. But then I would say there's also an enormous problem, is that just the diversity of individuals who are radicalized means that there's no one universal solution or no one sort of text that you can impart. I think it's very much of an individual phenomenon and also a community phenomenon. But I think it's to be aware, it's exactly as you're describing. I recall that in the lead up to the 2005 attacks in London, MI5, the security service, had a year before presented to number 10 Downing Street a report that individuals were being recruited from college campuses. And the skepticism that was met, why would highly educated, obviously privileged, but at least if people weren't privileged, were taking advantage from the best that society had to offer in terms of scholarships and so on, how could they be radicalized? And it was an expectation that this couldn't happen here, but to realize that this is exactly the modus operandi of the terrorist groups, is to reach into constituencies and sectors of populations that they hope will answer their, it's a hit or miss. Some will answer their clarion calls to battle, others won't, but they are constantly attempting to mine new sources of recruits.
Wow. Can you wait for the mic?
In the meantime, if you allow me, perhaps I can add that sometimes families are the site of radicalization. We have several cases in Spain where, we have this fabulous case in which the mother and the father, both of them of Moroccan origin, decided to send their teenagers to Morocco, to a particular mosque in Tetuan, and then they themselves took the trouble of finding the facilitator through which they could make the trip to Syria. That's an extreme case, but it's a real one. Then you have all those cases where, when the people is interrogated by the police or by the judge, they say, well, it was very common for my mother to say that Jews were You know, I mean, so sometimes families who are not yet well accommodated in sociocultural terms to the country they moved into.
Was this a second generation family, or was it?
No, the parents are first generation migrants.
First generation.
So the sons, usually sons more than daughters, are second generation. So that is young people born or raised in the country. Sometimes they are brought into the country at the age of 4, 5, 7. We consider that to be second generation because they underwent the school socialization process inside our Western society.
Thank you. Your question?
Hi, my name is Celine Herm with CACI, and I'm actually either an immigrant or first or second generation myself from Turkey. But your comments about that second generation are really sticking with me because coming from also from a development background, I think about the social, the family, these factors that are often admitted in national security thinking about how radicalization happens. But then when you kept on saying second generation, I kept on thinking about other populations, for example, the Turks in Germany, where it feels like, and I don't have the numbers here, that the percentage of radicalized youth there is far less, be it proportionately or not. And I'm wondering, has that ever been considered as a case study for what you're doing?
Well, that's a very good point of yours. Yeah, actually, until recently, levels of radicalization among descendants of Turks in Germany, some second generation descendants of Turkish immigrants in Germany, exhibited significantly lower levels of radicalization than second generation descendants from Moroccans or Algerians or Pakistanis, to mention cases I'm familiar with. In those cases, I think you have to go back to the culture they are coming from. And this combination of Kemalism and Sufism that you find in Turkey is not exactly what you find when describing the Islamic culture in Algeria or Pakistan, isn't it? So we think that plays an important role. Now, things are changing. Things are changing. Second generations are slowly adopting the outlook of older second generations, because now all this propaganda is affecting, is eroding the influence of this cultural background. And I have to say that if we are speaking about second generations with different, I mean, some of them educated, some of them only college educated, some of them just with secondary education, some of them already working as lawyers, some of them unskilled workers. I mean, the variety is so amazing that we take seriously the issue of identity crisis. Identity crisis. And I mean, we know there's a strong tradition in migration studies about identity crisis. The problem is that you have many, many ways to solve this identity crisis, not necessarily by means of violence. But think for a moment, the jihadism is not the only phenomenon where we observe this possibility of solving an identity crisis by adopting a very strong, exclusive ideology which justifies violence. We find that also among second-generation people from Central American families who join the Moras and other groups where violence is also a key component of ideology and behavior. So it's not exceptional to jihadism. But we have a real trouble with second generation. second generation are not, they might be socially integrated, but not socioculturally adapted. The extent to which we would like them to, just give me an example. Sorry, don't give me an example. I was going to give you an example. Last December, a year ago, I was in Amsterdam at a meeting where organized by the Moroccan authorities and the Dutch authorities on the issue of second generations. And there was this man, like 20-something, descendant of a couple from Casablanca. He himself was born in the Netherlands. He had the Dutch nationality, although you know that you can not renounce to the Moroccan nationality, but you know. And at some point in the meeting, he says something that should really made the member of the Dutch administration who was in the table, he reacted very nervously to that. I mean, very few countries in the world have the social welfare system and invest that much in the immigrant community as the Netherlands. He said this: no matter how good your social policy is, no matter how good your educational policy is, no matter how excellent your health services are, I will never be integrated into this society. And he became nervous. He said, but why? How come you say so? Simple. This is a democracy, and democracy is haram. We were not talking to a jihadist, but we were talking to a Salafist. And our point is that, and further research has to be done in other countries in Europe, to see if the correlation that we find in Spain between Salafism and jihadism can also be established in other areas. Because when someone asks, why Catalonia? Well, first of all, is it because they have more migrants than any other region in Spain? No, the percentage of jihadists residing in Catalonia is overrepresented with respect to the percentage of Muslim immigration in Catalonia. That's very clearly so. But then you have to remember that Catalonia has an astonishing concentration of Salafist congregations. I mean, out of, let's say, 200 congregations, close to 1/3 are Salafi congregations. Isn't that an important fact? It is an important fact.
Let me go this side of the room to restore the balance. There on the left side, gentleman with your hand, yeah.
Dan Bisbee, University of Pittsburgh. A question for you, Dr. Hoffman. We've talked about the big picture drivers of global jihad. We all know one of the major sources of bin Ladenism or al-Qaedism has been the behavior of the Saudi royal family in the past. And I'd be curious, in your perspective, with the recent moves by Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman to liberalize Saudi society or decorrupt it in some ways, what impact might this have on global jihad?
Well, it obviously would have, it would have had more effect 30 years ago when Wahhabism began to be exported throughout the world. I think it's, unfortunately, the ideology has taken a life of its own and has its own self-sustaining momentum. So, insofar as that there are still Saudi nationals that have been foreign fighters, as there are, who have joined either ISIS or al-Qaeda, I suppose we'll have to wait and see whether the reforms staunch that flow or not. But, to a large extent, the problem has manifested itself over the decades, and, can it be reversed? That's the question. Any development along these lines is certainly to be welcomed, but it's a problem that, as I said, is rather more long-standing.
Good morning. Fletcher King, World Affairs Council of Delaware. Question I have, Professor Reinares, is you mentioned the legal system in Spain was sort of catching up to the reality of terrorism in Spain. Could you address or talk about our concerns with throughout Europe? Is the legal system still far behind? Is that a problem of leakage, if you will, in terms of letting these terrorists go? Because this was one of the great concerns about releasing prisoners from Guantanamo, that they could be quickly put back into society and re-radicalized. Just where do you see things today?
Thank you for the question. Legal systems with respect to counterterrorism in the context of the European Union are Europeanized. The framework decisions or directives, as from this year, are adopted, including definitions of legal offenses, different new types of offenses that have to be incorporated to the national anti-terrorist legislation or the national criminal codes, depending on the case. And we have basically two critical moments. 2002, following the 9/11 attacks, a framework decision was adopted, which contributed strongly to the adoption of legal definitions of terrorism across the European Union, because up to then, only a few countries had considered terrorism a criminal offense. Needless to say, the UK, Spain, France, but not that many. And when the Madrid train bombings took place, several European Union member states missed the deadline to implement the 2002 framework decision. So, following a major attack, implementation is usually accelerated. It takes a major attack for the implementation to be properly completed. It was after the attacks on January 2015 in Paris, a new legislation was introduced in many European Union member states, in which, for all of you to understand, many legislations within the European Union did not consider a terrorist offense to go and undergo training at a terrorist camp abroad. Only if you come back and try to do something, will arrest you. If not, well, now, many of those countries, because we still have countries where this legislation has to be properly implemented, consider foreign fighting for a designated listed terrorist organization a terrorist offense. But despite the fact that we have all these legal systems increasingly converging increasingly in terms of the definition of terrorism and definition of terrorist offenses, then European Union member states have different police styles. So I mean, how come when last Christmas, when the attack took place in Germany, how come that year Germany arrested, I don't remember exactly, it was 15 people, and Spain 70? I mean, there's something wrong here. It is something wrong. So those police styles will explain a lot the number of detentions. Some countries will require more than others. Spain, for instance, has adopted, following the Madrid bombings, adopted the decision to anticipate police operations. Beyond a certain point, when uncertainty is there and you are not sure about what is going to happen, then you break down the cell. The problem is that when you do this, the proofs will allow you to perhaps convict people for up to 6, 7, 8 years. Whereas if you wait more and the investigation continues for perhaps 1 more year or a couple of years, but if something happens in between, Spain is arresting people, Italy is deporting people, isn't it? So every country has a different style in addressing this phenomenon. So it's not everything about legislation. Then how do you use that legislation for actual law enforcement operations?
Thank you. On that note, we're going to have to cut it off. We've going into the lunch hour, and we very much appreciate your patience here. And I know many of you are hungry. Lunch is outside, but please, let's give a round of applause for these wonderful presentations. And buy a copy of Bruce's book. So we'll resume at 1 o'clock.